Hi, welcome back to my channel. We're going to do a story of history episode, and we're going to do about the history of Ukraine, which I think is pretty timely considering everything that's happening in Ukraine right now with being attacked by Russia. We could get more information about the country and how it started and a little bit about its history and just learn something about it. I am very sorry for all the people of Ukraine. I've been watching all the news, very upset everything that we've been seeing, and hopefully there's going to be some kind of resolution to this, and it's going to happen soon before any more people get hurt and killed. All right, so let's just jump into the video.
Ukrainian identity long precedes the formation of any nation-state on this soil. The modern geopolitical entity and the current Ukrainian crisis can all trace their roots back to the land's unique geography and some of Europe's most fascinating cultures. An identity that has its foundations in no less than 3 geographic features: the Eurasian steppes, the Dnieper River, and of course, the Black Sea. These 3 very important parts of Ukraine not only shape its culture and identity, but have also made Ukraine a pawn in the strategic and economic games of larger powers, especially between Russia and the West. During the centuries of Russian hegemony, this was less of a problem. Monarchs and autocrats don't really care much for identity politics after all. But post-independence, the centuries of influence from outside powers have started to show. But Ukraine has its own nationhood and a story that goes all the way back to the migration of nomads through the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Well, it's been a long time coming, the remake of my old Ukraine video. Let's see if I can get it right this time. Now I know what you're thinking. Doesn't Ukraine's history begin with the Slavic migrations? And the answer is kind of yes, but the nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppes are inseparable from Ukraine's early development. A steppe, in geographic terms, if you're not aware, lends itself almost exclusively to the development of nomadic societies. They lack geographic boundaries for defense, materials for building, and the grazing patterns of animals mean that, well, you go where the food goes. This is one of the reasons why the horse was domesticated in the steppes. It made travel and hunting easier, and facilitated the raiding of rival tribes. And if a horde got big enough, it might start raiding, say, the crumbling Roman Empire. Hordes of Alans, Huns, Avars, Bulgars, and Khazars had passed through this area on their way to the rich lands of Rome, and each had left a massive influence on the Slavs and directly caused their migrations in the first place. If you think about it, the only place being worse than Rome would have been like anything on the way to Rome. Next is our second geographic feature, the Dnieper River, which means we get to talk about Vikings. Now, the lands of the Slavs, you see, were pretty irresistible to the Swedish Vikings. No centralized control, tons of wealth to raid and trade for, and hundreds of miles of long navigable rivers through it all, at the end of which lies the jackpot itself, Constantinople. It wasn't long before these Norsemen, who the Slavs called Rus, had built a huge trade empire centered on the Dnieper River, an old Khazar trading post called Kiev. Now, of course, the Slavs did eventually expel the Vikings from their land, but then quite ironically, politely asked them to return and rule them, which began the medieval state known as the Kievan Rus. To try and create some unity through religion, Prince Vladimir the Great sent envoys to all the neighboring lands to study their various faiths, who reported that the Jews had lost Israel and therefore couldn't possibly be a blessed people. The Muslim Bulgars were sad and stinky, their words, not mine, and also prohibited drinking, to which old Vlad here laughed, saying drinking is the joy of the Rus, before finally settling on Christianity. To be specific, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, ostensibly because of how impressed his envoys were with the Hagia Sophia, but between you and me, I think they were just trying to suck it up to the Byzantines. His son, who had become known as Yaroslav the Wise, greatly expanded the prosperity of the Rus state with Ukraine's oldest body of codified laws. Although the Rus were pretty prosperous, they soon fragmented into regional rival city-states for 2 main reasons. One was the arrival of the Cumans, who took control of Crimea and severely handicapped their trade routes, and 2 was the decline of its most wealthy ally, Constantinople, thanks to a little event called the Fourth Crusade. You really can trace a lot of Europe's history to this event, huh? Due to increased infighting, the Rus cities were at their weakest point in decades, and so probably wouldn't deal very well with, say, a horde of more than 30,000 mounted archers from Mongolia. Ooh, just their rotten luck. The part I want to focus on here during an era called the Mongol-Tatar yoke is not so much the rapid rise of the Golden Horde, which made the Rus its glorified cash cow through extortion, but rather its inevitable and arguably more important collapse. Because in what was the medieval Rus state, 3 regional powers would come to fill the Mongol vacuum, forever driving a wedge between the northeast and the southwest. Moscow would consolidate in the north, becoming the genesis of the Russian state, but for Ukraine, that genesis was in Lithuania. It's hard to conceptualize this today, but the Lithuanian state once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, later forming a union with Poland, absorbing swathes of those old Mongol Rus lands, which in Latin they called Ruthenia. This was the turning point for the lands of the Rus controlled by the West, diverging from those controlled by Moscow. Through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, what would become Ukraine had a direct line to Western philosophy and liturgy, with the Greek Catholic, or Uniate Church, flourishing in this period, whereas Moscow was isolated and inherited its autocratic rule from the Mongols. Even more so, symbolically, Moscow saw itself as the Third Rome, the defender of the Orthodox faith, which further alienated it from the West.
They seem to
Then we
always
have
be
our third regional
alienated.
power, the Crimean Khanate, a rump state of the Mongol-influenced Cumans, whom the Slavs simply called Tatars. And here we get to talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of Ukrainian history. With the introduction of serfdom, a more severe form of feudalism, thousands of peasants fled to the vast, open, sparsely populated frontiers to escape subjugation. Embracing their nomadic roots, living off the land free and fairly, they constructed a whole society with refugees, peasants, escaped serfs and slaves, Tatars, Ruthenians, Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims alike. They would become perhaps the most important piece of Ukraine's identity, the Cossacks. It's hard for me to overstate just how powerful the Cossacks became. Not only were they instrumental in leveraging their autonomy and powerful armies in service of the Polish crown, but they became inseparable from the idea of self-determination. The roots of Ukrainian ideas of independence were the Cossacks. And if they weren't treated the way they wanted to be, as equal autonomous partners, then they would be more than happy to fight on behalf of someone else. An opportunity they soon took during the Second Northern War. The Northern Wars were a long series of not altogether related events, but basically amounted to these 4 powers butting heads for more territory, especially over the Baltic Sea. But the part we're going to focus on is the Kamelnitsky Uprising, and for this we have Joe from the channel Jabsy.
Although the Cossacks had formed a close bond with the Commonwealth and had participated in numerous wars against the Turks and Tatars, the spirit of independence within their homeland, the Zaporozhian Siege, lived on. Tensions had reached a boiling point when King of Poland, John Casimir II, treated the siege with contempt and made efforts to curtail their autonomy, spurred by many local Cossack uprisings. When wars broke out between the empires of Russia, Sweden, and Poland-Lithuania, the Cossacks took the opportunity to assert their independence and revolted under the leadership of Hetman Bohdan Kamelnitsky, aligning themselves with Moscow. To this day, it is still unclear whether the treaty between the Tsar and the Cossacks aimed for further integration within the Russian Empire, or simply as a temporary military cooperation. But the Russian Empire's growth in the 18th century would ensure that Russia's interests would soon dominate. However, right-bank Ukraine still remained loyal to the Commonwealth, and when the left-bank Cossacks invaded Poland on the side of Russia, it set off a series of brutal atrocities remembered in Poland as the Deluge, and in right-bank Ukraine it is known as the Ruin. This pivotal event would not only weaken the Commonwealth as a regional power, but also result in the creation of a Cossack hegemony within the ironically far more heavy-handed rule of the Russian Tsars. And if you'd like to learn more about this period, come check out my video on the Kamelnitsky Uprising over on my channel Jabsy.
Now, basically from the onset of the uprising, the Cossacks were treated with a certain degree of suspicion by the Russians. They were all too happy to use them to defend against Tatar raids and even to aid them in their conquest of Siberia, but the Tsars knew all too well that a Cossack revolt could spell absolute disaster if they ever lost the Hetmanate's favor. All the Cossacks wanted was independence, and Russia simply couldn't allow that to happen. Their fears were pretty well founded, as it turns out, since the Cossacks again switched sides in support of Sweden during the Great Northern War, but this time at the disastrous Battle of Poltava. The Cossack host was defeated, and from this point on, the seeds of malicious distrust in Ukraine had been sown. Russian control over the Cossacks, and Ruthenians in general, would slowly increase over time. A accelerated by the partitions of Poland, where all of Ukraine, save for Galicia, found itself under Russian rule. There was, of course, an added benefit to increased control over the Ruthenians, and that was because they stood between them and something the Russians deeply coveted: the Black Sea. From the 15th century onward, it was clear to the Russians that the only way to truly become a world power like those of Western Europe was through a large, powerful navy, but they lacked much in the way of seaports. This was one of the motivations behind the Northern Wars, after all, gaining control of the Baltic Sea. And it wasn't long before Russia started eyeing the Black Sea as well, inconveniently controlled by the Ottomans and the Tatars. One Russo Turkish War later, Crimea was now easy pickings and annexed in 1783, just in case you thought Russia annexing Crimea was a new phenomenon. As with most of the territories acquired by the Russian Empire, Ukraine was heavily suppressed. Its Cossack hosts lost more and more of their autonomy, the Ruthenian language we now call Ukrainian was banned, and rebellions were violently put down. This was all part of a process known as Russification, and one of its largest proponents was Catherine the Great. Jews were especially affected by these policies, restricted to stay in an area known as the Pale, in small, economically disadvantaged communities called the shtetl, which greatly contributed to the suppression of Jewish culture. Now, although 19th century Russia was succeeding in the spreading of its internal power, the same cannot be said for its place on the world stage, and their intellectual control over Ruthenia would weaken due to several reasons. Firstly was the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas of self-determination during the French Revolution. Secondly, the revolutions of 1848. And thirdly, the very overt demonstration that Russia was not the invincible power it fancied itself. Losing major world conflicts in the disastrous campaigns of the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War had exposed a weakness in the Tsarist regime that had stubbornly lacked reform and industrialization on the scale of other nations. It's not surprising then to see that Ukraine was at the ready to go its own way during the worst conflict Europe was to know at the time, at the outbreak of the First World War, the effects of which would lead to the Russian Civil War. It's worthwhile to remember that the Russian Civil War was by no means a monolith. It was a complicated network of ever-changing alliances, and this is no more evident than in Ukraine, where it is remembered as the Ukrainian War for Independence, an independence they ultimately did not achieve. The anti-Bolshevik White Army allied with some of the Ukrainian nationalists, who in turn had allied with the Second Polish Republic. The Black Army had initially seized swathes of territory to form an anarcho-socialist society before eventually allying with the Bolshevik Reds. Wow. And the Bolsheviks even used Ukraine as a bargaining chip to seal a peace with Germany in 1918, but also with Poland in 1921, which is where the borders were ultimately settled on again, splitting Ukraine in two. It was not until the Second World War that West Ukraine would be reunited, by force. I've covered the history of the Soviet Union in a separate video, so I won't go into too much detail about this era here, but I do want to go over some important details in Ukraine's more contemporary development. The first was that of exploitation. Ukraine became a massive center of industrialization and natural resources in the Soviet era, making it a huge target for two of humanity's worst dictators. Not only Hitler during the invasion of the Soviet Union, but also the Soviets' own premier Joseph Stalin, whose land reforms would cause the Great Soviet Famine, known as the Holodomor, which led to the deaths of between 3 and 12 million Ukrainian peasants. Wow. A majority of the more than 2 million Soviet Jews who perished in the Holocaust were also from Ukraine, which erased almost all of its historical Jewish community. In Kiev alone, the SS killed more than 30,000 Jews in just 2 days during the infamous Babin Yar massacre. The second is more to do with Ukraine's current geopolitical standpoint, which I think is vital to understanding post-independence Ukraine, which has been in a push and pull in two directions directly linked to its unique geography. The vast open steppes are still envied by the Kremlin, who has lost one of its great buffer zones to NATO. Pro-Western leadership in this young nation has been hamstrung by Russian influence on more than one occasion. Russia wants Ukraine to be a quiet and stable ally, and they've actively supported pro-Russian separatists since 2014. The Dnieper River still forms the nucleus of the nation, and a divide that has gone back centuries by influences from outside powers. The inhabitants on the east of this river are still more likely to identify as and to speak Russian, thanks to centuries of oppression under the Tsars and the Soviet Union. And of course, the Black Sea is still as hotly contested as ever. Fearing Ukraine moving to closer ties with the European Union and the rampant instability of the Ukrainian crisis, Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula to protect its Black Sea ports. The current Ukrainian crisis may feel new, but it's worth remembering that we're not at the end of Ukraine's story, nor are we ever. We're in the middle of its most recent chapter, and conceptualizing its past may help with its future going forward.
All right, so this video was made August 14th of 2020. So this is something that actually 2 years later is playing out, with Russia attacking Ukraine and literally trying to, I guess, take back the whole country. It just seems that's what they're trying to do. They've already have Crimea, they held on to that. So yeah, now they're completely trying to just either destroy the country or take it over, or a combination of the two. I don't know. I think we're also seeing in the resistance of the Ukrainian people a lot of that strength of the Cossacks. So I think that's still playing out as well, that history of their ancestors, and how they look at freedom. And they're incredibly brave, patriotic people. And I think, this is really an interesting video that you can see where this history has played into what we're seeing on the news today. So very interesting. Maybe in the future we'll see some of the videos that he has made about the history of Russia and maybe these individual battles. So I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I did. I certainly learned some stuff. And I hope you'll come back for the next video, and I'll see you again later. Thank you.